In this discussion, we'll look at nationalization and privatization, but also look at regulation and deregulation as ways of government intervention. When we look at nationalization, nationalization refers to the process whereby private sector firms are transferred into public sector ownership and are owned and controlled in some way by the government. There are clear advantages and disadvantages of nationalization. Let's look at some of the advantages of nationalization. The first advantage of nationalization is that it can benefit from economies of scale because of the fact that now there's only one firm producing the industry's output and all the other firms will close down. We will have large economies of scale, which can result in lower costs and possibly lower price as well. Also, the fact that now the industry is state owned, it can avoid a lot of these wasteful duplication of resources that may happen because of competition. Third, the state ownership is also easier to control any negative externality, and also we can encourage positive externality. So, for example, if there was previously a case where there was a production externality, we can take care of it because now the government is owning the resources. Lastly, the nationalized industry will prevent monopoly power being held by a private firm. When a private firm owns the monopoly power, we can say they can be exploitative. On the other hand, when a government is owning an enterprise, they can use that to exploit economies of scale and offer lower prices. Let's look at some of the disadvantages of nationalization. The first disadvantage of nationalization is that a nationalized industry may lack the incentive to be efficient compared to the situation in the private sector. And the reason is something called X inefficiency. Due to a lack of competition, you may not have an incentive to become as efficient as a private sector firm. Secondly, nationalized industries may also lack competitive pressure, such as pressure to be innovative. We saw in the private industry, whenever there is going to be competition, there is a possibility of dynamic efficiency as well, where firms are trying to sort of spend money on new products and try to be as efficient as possible in order to remain a monopoly. So, nationalization, because it's now a monopoly established by the government, it may not have the same incentive structure. Thirdly, it is also possible that some decisions taken by the nationalized industry could be primarily because of political reasons rather than economic reasons. A good example of this is when Pakistan nationalized its industries. Many of those were done because of political reason rather than economic reasons, and as a result of that, many of these industries were inefficient and also employing many more resources than required. Lastly, a state owned firm may still be in a position to abuse its monopoly power. The fact that you are state run doesn't really mean you cannot be acting like a monopoly. If, for example, a state run organization decides to do that, then there will be consumers who will be unhappy because now they have to pay a much higher price for a firm that is monopoly and they have no power whatsoever to control it. Whereas nationalization is now the process of transferring ownership of assets from private sector to public sector, we also have seen privatization to take place. Privatization refers to the transfer of ownership in the opposite direction. This is where the public sector ownership is now given to the private sector, and the idea behind this is that when the resources are owned by the private sector, there will be better efficiency of allocation of resources. A nationalized or state-owned firm may have a possibility to be not as efficient as possible, and if that happens, then the government may like to privatize a firm or industry by transferring ownership from public sector to private sector. Now, the critics of nationalization point out that without competition between a number of private firms, efficiency may be less than otherwise would be the case. This is why the process of privatization has become so popular in many countries in the world, with competition in a market leading to greater efficiency. Even in Pakistan, recently, many of the state-owned organizations are either fully privatized or partially privatized in order to improve sort of their efficiency and reduce the market failure of using resources in an inefficient manner. The hope with privatization is that with greater competition in a market, price is likely to be lower and output higher than it otherwise will be, and therefore consumers will benefit from this lower price and higher quantity. Another reason why privatization may become an important thing for a government is to raise revenue by selling off state owned enterprises, something which is seen in Pakistan, where Pakistan is also trying to sell these state run organizations primarily because they want to raise revenue so that the government operations can run properly. The term privatization can refer to a number of different government initiatives beyond simply transferring ownership from the public to the private sector through the issue of shares and the creation of a public limited company. The other methods can include deregulations, contracting out, and franchising. So let's look at different forms of privatization. The first form of privatization is when we are looking at a sale of assets. This is where a nationalized firm or industry is sold to the private sector. We also call this process as denationalization. Now, the firm therefore ceases to be a state owned organization and becomes a private sector company, usually a public limited company. A good example of this in Pakistan is how PSO, Pakistan State Oil, was previously a publicly owned company, but now it's a privately owned company, fully owned by a private sector and listed on the stock exchange. Another form of privatization is called deregulation. This is where the government is now going to remove restriction placed on producers in a market in order to encourage competition. So all the regulation, rules, controls, and laws that were imposed before by the state on a firm will now be removed so that more competition is allowed to take place in the market. And the arguments against X inefficiency is that if firms are overregulated, they may become complacent, which may result in X inefficiency. Overregulation may stifle innovation and risk taking that would otherwise lead to new development that could benefit consumers. There's also a danger of deregulation if firms may take too much advantage of their newfound freedom from rules and regulation, then it could also be harmful for consumers. A good example of this is that in 2000s, many banks were allowed to operate more freely. As a result of that, they started many practices that resulted in the financial crisis that happened in the late 2000s. So the government has to ensure that the deregulation that takes place does not allow the firms to become so liberal in their practices that it can harm consumers. The third kind of privatization or practice that results in privatization is contracting out. Under such arrangement, the public sector issues a contract to a private firm for the supply of some of the goods and services. One advantage of this could be that there is also a possibility of bringing private sector firms to provide some of the funding. So, in some countries, we have things like private sector initiative and private public partnership called the PPP, which allows private sector to provide funds to these initiatives. Another form of privatization could be franchising, where the private sector firm may be allowed to bid for a franchise to operate a particular part of the industry. So, one part or one process of the industry is given to the private sector. For example, if an airline is a public sector organization, then the food that is served in the airline can be franchised to a private sector firm. In many markets, sometimes the government may need to regulate the market, especially the newly privatized enterprises require regulation in order to make sure that the desired efficiency is achieved. So regulation is seen as a way to go about where the government tries to use rules or law in order to control the market failure. There are many examples of regulation in different countries, such as in relation to the control of monopolies, the protection of environment, consumer protection, and so on. When it comes to regulation of monopolies, sometimes the government may decide to introduce a policy on mergers and acquisitions. For example, if a proposed merger was thought to be against public interests, such as making a firm to be too powerful and therefore consumers to suffer, then the regulatory body can actually prevent this merger to take place. A government could also use a law or a rule to insist that if a monopoly firm did exist, it would need to guarantee that a minimum quality would apply to the goods and services which are provided. Also, they may control the prices or competition in a particular industry through regulation. Another way the government can intervene is simply through direct provision of goods and services. So this is where the government decides to allocate resources themselves to solve the problem of market failure. A good example of this could be provision of education and healthcare in many countries is done by the government. So the public health and public education is provided because these goods are merit in nature, and if left to the market force of demand and supply, they will be under provisioned. Similarly, public goods are provided by the government because the market fails to provide these goods at all.